Okay, good evening everybody, dear students and our dear guests. I'm very happy that you are here for next lecture in our series on Hungarian architecture. I'm very happy that we have here our dear guest Dániel Kovács, who is architecture historian, critic and curator working in Budapest and dealing with, let's say, 20th century Hungarian architecture and also contemporary architecture. I was hoping that he will give you an insight in what's going on in Hungary regarding architecture right now, and he's exactly doing this in frame of his lecture, so I hope he will help you also with your reflections on the other architects that gave their presentations, like in frame of the, or they will give the presentation in frame of the reflections on architecture. So Daniel, I will not talk more about you because I introduced you already in the beginning of our series. So again, I'm very happy that you are here and the floor is yours. You have your own microphone.
Yes, I hope it works, doesn't it? Yeah, you can hear me, right? That's amazing. Hey. Yes, thank you very much for the introduction and also for the invitation, Henrietta. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming and being interested in the series. It's amazing, by the way, that Reflections on Architecture is dealing with Hungarian architecture. That's a first for us. I wasn't expecting this, but this is very nice. I was in a little bit of a trouble when I got this invitation because I have so many stuff going on in my mind that I couldn't really choose what I should talk about. Usually I deal with modernist heritage and how it's being treated in Hungary right now. Actually, that's what one of our projects with Paradigma Ariadne, one of the office that was already part of the series, we worked on the previous Venice Architecture Biennale exhibition, and we dealt with that. But I know that Attila, who was here from Paradigma Ariadne, already talked about that, so I won't get into that. And then I thought that it would obviously be more interesting to talk about contemporary architecture in Hungary and what's happening right now in the country and in Budapest especially. But you have also heard about that because that's what the series is about. And then I realized that all right, but actually what you're seeing or what you heard about is just one part of the contemporary scene in Hungary. It's just one face of the architecture what's happening. And then I decided that, all right, I'm going to dwell into this topic because I think it's super interesting that what we think of as contemporary architecture is not necessarily what others perceive as contemporary architecture. So I'm going to talk about the different faces of contemporary architecture in Hungary. Because what you see when you come visit Budapest or Hungary, for example, is that we have amazing contemporary architecture. You have already seen some of the examples in the previous lectures, I think, and we have some award-winning buildings or constructions, such as the Metro 4 station. So this station, for example, and the other station designed by Sporer Architects won awards in 2016. We have, okay, yes. At the same year, the headquarters of the Central European University, designed by an Irish architecture office, won the same award by the Royal Institute of British Architects, the International Excellence Award. This was also a very big thing in Hungary at that time. A Hungarian studio just won the Piranesi Award like 2 years ago. This is especially a kind project for my heart because I was the nominator that year. So I was the one who nominated this project, and I'm of course, super proud of that. It didn't win because of me, unfortunately, but still, I think it deserved the award 2 years ago. And these are just two examples which I especially like, of which the pictures are quite telling, that there is a very interesting and diverse architecture scene in Hungary, I think, at this moment. And I especially looked for these two projects because these are not by the architects who were invited to the series, but by different architects, but still very interesting examples. But then again, this is the point where I started to think about the fact that, all right, is this Hungarian architecture? Is this what's happening in Hungarian architecture right now? This is not entirely true. This is the architecture of professionals, what we are seeing. This is how professionals imagine and talk and discuss about architecture. But there are different realms in architecture, right? There are different ways how people see architecture. Most of the non-architects, let's say that, all right? So normal people, sorry about that, they imagine architecture differently. They look for different purposes. They look for different meanings in architecture. They mostly look for something that's usable, a usable space. And that leads to very different architectural creations that we have seen before, such as creations like this, structures from the 60s, the 70s, erected as weekend houses in Hungary next to one of the thermal lakes. Or this is one of my favorites in Balatonkerese, a summer cottage. As we see in this picture, this kind of architecture, so architecture without architects, to quote one of the most famous people who talked about this before me, can also have its values, of course. It can convey nice proportions. It can show nice materials. It can give us aesthetically interesting content, but it doesn't necessarily involve architects. So this is what I call the architecture of people for this lecture, of course. And then there is a third realm. There is a third reality, which does usually involve architects, but not in the way that I have discussed before, and does usually involve people, but usually as not necessarily aimed to people. This is one of the most obvious examples of that architecture that I'm talking about, the third realm, if you may. But this is also one of the examples that belong to that category. And of course, it's the architecture of politics, what I'm talking about, what the third category is. This building is especially telling, I think, because it was finished in 2015 by one of the best-known designer architects of Hungary, F. Kovács Attila. It was built by reusing a former train station, one of the train stations from where trains to Auschwitz, to the concentration camps, departed in 1944. And it became a center of remembrance, a museum, but it has never opened. So this building has been standing there for 7 years now without opening, because as it turned out after they finished it, the actual content was never discussed with most of the people whom it is about. So when creating the museum, content-wise, it was not at all communicated towards the Jewish community in Budapest. And of course, they were quite upset because of this. They even contested the name of the building, which is called House of Fates, because the most important Hungarian novel about Jewish fates in Hungary, obviously I'm talking about a Nobel Prize-winning novel by Imre Kertész, is called Fatelessness. So it especially talks about how fate is taken away by those people who are deported to the concentration camps. And then we create a museum which is called House of Fates. Isn't that a little bit contrasting? So these two projects, and of course all the other projects that I'm going to talk about in the second half of this lecture, all the historical reconstruction projects that are currently going on in Budapest and in some ways in Hungary as well, are what I call the architecture of politics, because it's a third existing reality that is somehow nowadays completely departed from the other two realms. So it has not too much things to do with architects or how architects imagine architecture, and not too much to do also with average people and how they imagine and talk about and use architecture. When I got here, I just remember this photo. This is my son. He's 4 years old in this picture, and he's invisible in this picture, so you can't see him. Obviously, at least that's how he perceives the world in this picture. He's not there, he's invisible. It would be super hard, and I know it's super hard to explain to a 4-year-old that he's not actually invisible when he covers his eyes. But he believes that. He perceives the world through his eyes closed and covered with his hands, and therefore he believes, he knows actually, that he's invisible. Why am I showing you this? Because everything is about perception. Everything is about what you construct, what you create in your head about the surrounding world. And the existence of these 3 different architectural worlds, these 3 different architectural realities, tells a lot about that. These worlds have their own framework. They have their own ways of law. They have their own structure. And these structures, they do not have too much to do with each other. They have their own specific language, basically architectural language, in which language, for example, the words real, original, true, these have different meanings when we are talking about the architecture of people, the architecture of professionals, or that one of politics. This is, for me, as a historian, as an art historian, is super interesting, I have to say. I don't necessarily agree with what's happening in these different realms, but it's extremely fascinating that these realms can exist next to each other. And as I started to think about this, I realized that I won't be able to convey what I think about this by just showing contemporary examples. So I'm also going to use a few historical examples, precedents from Hungary, of course. So I will start this lecture with a short introduction of the interwar period, and then I'm going to discuss my period, which is the post-war period, and then I'm going to talk about contemporary architecture. And this is actually where I start the lecture. So this is the first image. This is the 16th slide. Sorry about the long introduction, but I think I needed to make a basement basically for the edifice that I'm going to create here in the forthcoming 3.5 hours. Thank you. No, that was a joke, obviously. Hopefully, yes. So on parallel realities, I don't state that there are parallel realities. I'm just going to talk about parallel realities, all right? Yeah. A short disclaimer, all the names are in Hungarian order because I started to do that now, like lately, because at the end my name is Kovács Dániel and not Dániel Kovács, which how I usually introduce myself in English. And yeah, and the other thing is just some notes. All right, as I promised, a very short overview on historical precedents, and if I start to talk too much about this, I will kindly ask my colleagues here to wave their hands if it seems to be too long. All right, I'm basically going to talk about 3 important people, 3 leaders of the state in the forthcoming hour. One is a governor, one is a party secretary, and the third is a prime minister. And despite the differences in the position, they are basically 3 people at the very top who define in certain ways how Hungarian architecture is evolving, what is happening in the profession. And I think therefore it is apt to name architectural periods after them. So the Horthy period, which is basically the interwar period named after the governor of the country, Horthy Miklós at that time. I wanted to show a few images from this period because it's absolutely, not absolutely, but in certain ways completely different from what happened in Slovakia and in Czechoslovakia at that time. Because, you know, countries, most of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe at that time used modern architecture and the language of modern architecture to convey their independence, to convey that they are a progressive, open and tolerant nation who are willing to go forward with time, looking to the future. I think that is basically what also happened here in Bratislava. Actually, today, while walking around the city, we have also seen some beautiful example of that by Ignác Weinwurm, a social housing block in the outskirts of Bratislava. That's totally like avant-garde architecture at its best, I think, or functionalist, let's say that. What happened in Hungary at the same time, though, was that after losing the First World War, of course, a depressing trauma ruled the Hungarian elite, which was mostly comprised at that time by members of the aristocracy and by members of the church. This was the leading elite of the country. So they didn't really want to look forward to the future, right? Because the future wasn't that promising at that time in Hungary. So what they did instead, they looked back to the past. And then they found a period in Hungarian architecture, namely the 18th century, Baroque, what they preferred. And the 20s in Hungarian architecture is all about neo-Baroque. It's all about historicism. In some cases also about neo-Gothic and Romanticism or neo-Romanesque architecture, but mostly about neo-Baroque. This is the age of the neo-Baroque society, as one of the Hungarian historians called it. And in huge actual constructions, and in many cases during competitions, we see that historical facades, historicist buildings are imagined and then realized in the 1920s. So Bauhaus is already happening, Wutemas is already happening in Moscow. Everybody is striving for something to express that they are really into the future. Art Deco is happening in Paris. And Hungarian architects are constructing buildings like these, which look like that if they were like 100 years before. It's super interesting. But it's mostly the pressure of society, the pressure of actual commissioners, and the pressure of the elite that leads Hungarian architecture to this. As a matter of fact, modern architecture is still, it's always there, you know, it just pops up its head whenever it can. So I just wanted to show you a few examples about modernism at the time in Hungary, but this is really, modernism in the 20s and the 30s is not the architects of politics, that's for sure, it's the architecture of professionals. So what happens is that some of the architects who go to study to foreign countries, like to the Bauhaus, for example, after a while they return to the country, and some others, based on contemporary magazines, what they get to learn about the world, and some also who are based in education. One very noble example is Kocsis Iván, who is the only teacher on a Hungarian University of Technology who lets people who lets students design in modern style, because all the other teachers, they force students to design in historical styles, but there is this one guy who lets people to do whatever their stuff is. So there are some exceptions, and these exceptions, they manage to realize usually some buildings in modern style. There are some of the guys who returned from Bauhaus, or from basically the related to Bauhaus, such as Forbat Alfred, or Marcel Breuer, or Molnár Farkas, and so on. And there are a few independent modernists, such as Rimanóczy Gyula. And what I really liked in this picture, which I just found in our archives, this shows the construction of a modernist three-story villa. This is a quite nice small villa in Debrecen, and even during construction it shows, especially here, oh, I can do this, that's great, that, oh, this is modernism, right? So this is a staircase, a spiral staircase which goes up to the topmost floor with a very nice glass enclosure at the top. This is modernism at its best. So this still happens, but in a smaller scale, in a way smaller scale than it happens here in Bratislava, for example. And a very telling example about the general situation is this one building. This is the same building what you see in the picture. the building is situated, the plot is situated very close to the castle in Buda. So there were regulations to create a historical facade in the 1930s. So the architects Miri and Lauber, which is one of the best modernist studios of Hungary at that time, they had to create a historical facade. But in the interior, they were free to do whatever they wanted to do. And they created this quite nice and undulating glass wall towards the courtyard. But this two-faced reality is very much in Hungary at that time. So there is the architecture of politics, which is neo-Baroque through its heart. There is the architecture of professionals, which is, this is what I want to do. And of course, there is the architecture of average people, which is somewhere between the two, not very much interested in what's happening with architects, not very much interested in what's happening with politics, but somehow still mirroring both of them. This is also very interesting, that whatever happens up slowly takes its way down, and it gets there. And even though this is I think, the 1930s, and there are some Art Nouveau-esque decorations, so this should be actually from like 30, 40 years before, they got there, and they managed to appear in one of the most remote villages in Hungary in the interwar period. The next period that I'm going to talk about is, so I skip a few years, I skip the Second World War, and I skip the early 50s, which is socialist realism. This is the very same what happened here. So directions come from Moscow. Okay, we will do that, and we will design historicist buildings. So during socialist realism, of course, in the 1950s, there isn't much discussion about what architects want to do or what people want to do. Everybody does what the politics want. All right, so there is no space for discussion, basically. What happens in the early 50s is this. And then when socialist realism goes away, the very same building gets redesigned in a modernist style. And then it receives one of the biggest awards ever received by Hungarian architecture in 1961. This is one of the 4 buildings for which Iparterv, the main state office of industrial design, receives the August Perret Prize, then founded by the International Association of Architects, the UIA. So, but this building had a long evolution, right? So in 1951, it started like this. It started as a socialist realist building. And in 1956, when the architect had the choice, finally, when he didn't have to work in historical style, he redesigned it. And this is the architecture of politics. This is the architecture of professionals, right? So this is what we like. This is what we prefer. This is like from Brazil. This is also from Brazil, by the way. This is not very much. This is a little bit like 1930s industrial architecture, but this very much follows the then contemporary Western, even South American architecture. And from the late 1950s, Hungarian architecture explodes. Basically, what we call the long 60s in Hungarian architecture, which is from the late 1950s to 1972, about. It's the heydays of Hungarian modernism. So whatever exciting happened in Hungary happened in that 14, 15 years, basically. Incredible possibilities open up. This is what you see on the picture is the first church, the first Roman Catholic church in Hungary financed by the state. I mean, in the socialist times, of course. Because of the extension of a factory, the state decided to demolish the chapel in the village in Holohasa. And they promised the community to build another one. And they managed to erect this church by the same architect, by the way. So this is also Csaba László. In the mid-1960s, I think it's still apparent that he very much likes Brazilian architecture, of course. But the singular fact that he managed to design such a building again in a very remote part of the country for the use of the church is amazing. So you couldn't have done that like 4 years before that. You couldn't have done that 10 years before that for sure. this really shows how modern architecture creates a way for the state to communicate its purposes, and also for the architects to accept that and to enhance that, actually. Because what happens from the end of the 1950s, that the state opens up, and Kádár János, the new ruler of the country, starts to create a socialist welfare state, basically, through an amazing array of construction projects for mass tourism, for example. An incredible amount of hotels are being constructed. This is one very nice example, which we have just visited a few weeks ago. Again, tourism by a restaurant by Kalmari Ferenc next to the Balaton Lake, which is at that time, which becomes the main goal or the main, area for mass tourism developments. And I wanted to show you this picture and the next picture by these beautiful buildings, the city center buildings in Szexárd by Jurcsik Károly, because these two shows that in the 60s, Hungarian architecture is basically based on two not that far away precedents or models, and one is then contemporary or a little bit earlier Scandinavian architecture, and the other one is then contemporary British architecture, of course. This is again something that opens up because the state accepts that architects are interested in modernism and accepts modernism as a way to realize its goals. In the 60s, Ernő Goldfinger, who is like the brutalist master in London, who designs the Trellick Tower and many other brutalist buildings, and who is of Hungarian origin, he announces a scholarship for young Hungarian architects. He invites Hungarian architects to go to Britain and to study. And amazingly, in the 60s, this idea gets realized. And there are architects who go to study to Britain, who take up work in offices in Britain. For example, actually, Kalmár Ferenc is one of them. And who then return to the country and bring all these ideas, all these impacts of contemporary British brutalism with them. And the Szexárd city center is actually one of the brightest examples of that process. Some of these buildings could, without any question, stand in a countryside town in Britain, in my opinion. And there are even several more examples, and the scholarship lasts, of course, until somebody decides not to come back to Hungary, but stay in Britain, of course, and then the whole system and the whole scholarship system collapses, unfortunately. But still, a lot of people manages to create this link between the two quite different and quite distant countries. One of my favorite examples when talking about how the Kádár era and how socialist modernism, let's say that, although not necessarily everybody likes that term, changed the people and changed cities in Hungary is water towers. Water towers became omnipresent at that time in Hungary, either designed by simple structural engineers. They are not simple. They are not at all simple, by the way. So they are usually quite difficult, and sometimes with the involvement of architects. So which obviously led to more aesthetic examples. This is also one very simple example. Obviously, what happens here is that water towers not only appear in the cityscapes of Hungary at that time, but they also replace church towers. So they became the new vertical symbols of a society under construction, a society which again strives towards a different future, towards a socialist future, and a society that takes care of its people. Because a water tower, what is it good for? It gives you fresh water, of course, which didn't happen before. So whenever you go out and you see this image, then you think about, oh, everything in the old days that was really bad, because we had these living conditions without electricity, without water, without anything. But this new state they gave us everything. They gave us new housing, they gave us water, they gave us electricity, they gave us infrastructure. So whatever happens now must be really good. And this idea is very efficiently conveyed by water towers, in my opinion. And by some other structures, of course. So this is the age when architecture finally, and maybe the first time ever, becomes a tool for state propaganda in Hungary in a very open and in a very efficient way, such as, like this is shown by this example, the TV tower and lookout tower in Miskolc, which after its construction appeared in numerous, by the way, so a lot of logos and emblems connected to the city and to the region, and it even appeared on the cover of a book about 100 years of Hungarian architecture. And what happens in so this is what we have seen. What we have seen before. This is a point in history where architects and politicians want to do the same. They think the same, and they do the same, and they work together. Right? In the 60s, there's a very good architect, Hofar Miklós, who creates this, and then the state uses it to advocate its goals. And even here, even the state propaganda, so the TV station uses the very same building to advertise itself. And strangely, I think it's very similar what happens in the architecture of people, in the everyday architecture, because although professional architects themselves, they hate that the cube houses or the Kádár cubes appear at this time from the 50s in Hungarian villages, and they replace traditional old buildings. Still, the average people, the everyday citizens, let's say that. I'm trying to avoid using words on everyday people, which could be understood as a negative connotation. I don't want to do this because I'm also an average person. So, but still, okay. So these kind of cube houses, based on a very similar plan and design and mass, are built as thousands, as tens of thousands in Hungary at that time, and they of course replace previous traditional dwellings. But this fact, which is, people love it. People love it, that there is a new symbol of progression in the villages. There is something which gives you a better standard of living than the previous buildings. And then this is in fact embraced by the state. This doesn't come from the state, but then it is embraced by it. So as this brochure from the 1960s about state-sponsored loans shows, that this is one of the model homes. And this is a very typical Kádár cube. This is one of the model homes that you can build, and the state helps you to build that, because it has housing issues and it has to solve it, and it doesn't really care what you do. So if you want to build a cube house, do it. Do it for yourself. We are not interested in how you ruin the perceived beautiful appearance of the villages. Yes, thanks Google. Sorry. Yeah, I will drink a little bit. It's just Coke. Okay, so like in the mid-1960s, what I talked about, what the state wants, what the architects want, and what average people want, in one point of time, it meets. There is one beautiful moment where these three worlds, they collide. It's like the collision of stars, like the state, the architects, and the average people. They somehow create this beautiful vision, which I'm going to show you. Yeah, if Charles Jenks is allowed to state that the demolition of Period Igo is the death of modern architecture, then I am allowed to say, although I don't want to compare myself to Charles Jenks, obviously, but this just happened, on the other hand. So there is a point in history where these three different realities, they align. And this is sometime in 1967. And I think my colleagues already know what I'm going to show you. Because in 1967, this building gets erected in Budapest. This is the round hotel, basically. It's called Körszálló in Hungarian, which means round hotel. Hotel Budapest. It's one of the new tourism developments in the city. It's a little bit in the outskirts, so it's a first. It's not a downtown hotel, but it's in the Buda Hills. And it gives an amazing view from basically all of the rooms, because it has a round shape. This is a very successful building architecture-wise, so it is praised in the press and by critics. And it is praised even so that the state actually issues a stamp about it. So the state accepts and acknowledges the success of this building, and they began to use it for state propaganda. They began to show it on stamps for average Joes that, hey, we do stuff like this. Do you like this? And then people love it. And this is the object that I wanted to show you, because this object is not an architectural model. This was created by an amateur model maker, Molnár Szilveszter, who was a craftsman. He worked for the factory of optics in Hungary, the Hungarian factory of optical mechanics, basically. And he had this hobby in the 1960s when he was still a bachelor. I know the story because it was told me by his daughter, actually. So he was still a bachelor, and he was looking for a hobby, and he decided to pick up all what fell down from his working bench in the factory and then start to create architectural models. And he liked this building, so he watched TV, of course. He followed the news, and then he went to the spot and measured the building by walking around it, of course, and then he made drawings. And yes, proportions are, well, they are not totally right. We can acknowledge that. But still, I mean, all these little details, so where the bistro terrace is, it's in the same spot, or the name of the restaurant actually was here, and so on. So if you look at the details, they are totally on spot. He really managed to look around in the building and to realize that. And what this model shows us, that he, as an absolutely everyday person, was so interested in contemporary architecture at that time that he did spend his time, energy, and money to create something which reminded him of contemporary architecture. So this is the point, sometime in 1967, when Molnár Szilveszter is still a bachelor, he's not married, so he has the time to build architectural models, and he creates this stuff. This is the symbol of these three worlds colliding. And then after that, everything goes wrong, basically. After that comes prefabricated housing, of course, which, like on paper, on posters, looks really nice and really promising, but in reality, it doesn't please anyone. It maybe only pleases the inhabitants for a while, but then this whole thing changes. And then modern architecture, maybe because of this fact that it was at one point equally liked by people, state, and architects, somehow freezes in Hungary and somehow doesn't let in any new influences. And what happens with some innovators such as Elemér Zalotai, whom I'm not going to show you here, or Makovec Imre, is that they are excluded from this canon. They are excluded from this history. They manage to realize a few buildings, but they are not accepted by the leaders, the storytellers of modern architecture in Hungary. So despite the fact that having these incredible visions about how architecture should yet again take a step forward, look into the future and realize something which might be more than modernism, which might be again a little bit more identifiable, a little bit more open towards traditions, towards history, this chapter never gets written in Hungarian architecture. these visions remain on paper. Imagine how interesting it would be if this would stand next to the Velence Lake or next to the Balaton, whatever. But instead, what Makovec realizes to build are these small-scale constructions, restaurants around the country. And by the time he manages to realize something bigger by the 70s, I mean, it loses its appeal, basically. It's of course very well received, especially in the international field, but in Hungary it never gets that. It never gets the real effect. And by the 70s, architecture basically loses its appeal. So despite the fact that there are some super interesting young architects working, there are some very interesting new ideas coming in, most of these remains on paper. So at the 70s and the 80s is about dreaming big and realizing little. This is one of the few examples that got realized, and what shows, I think, quite clearly the influence of then contemporary postmodern architecture. But also, this is one of the values that we never managed to see, actually, to realize that it's there, and it was demolished actually 14 years ago. And yeah, and then, of course, the change of the regime happens. And after 1989, I just wanted to give you an introduction up until the latest period, which I'm going to talk about, which is, of course, the period which has been going on since 2010. I just wanted to show you the 5 big disappointments of the post-change architecture in Hungary. The first is, of course, the Seville Expo in 1992. One of the best-known household names, Janaki István, wins the competition, but then the government gets its finger to the process, and what actually gets built is a new scheme by Makovec Imre, who, after the change of the regime, becomes suddenly a very important name in Hungarian architecture. And the government gives its vote to Makovec, who wasn't actually invited, or who wasn't taking part of the original competition. So this is one of the big slaps in post 1989 history, where the architectural profession, the architectural scene realizes that hey, we are not necessarily in favor anymore. Okay, so politics want to do something different than we want to do. We collaborated for decades. We got used to the idea that we work together, and then suddenly in 1992 they say that, hey, I don't want this competition, I want something else. And they do that, and it's a huge slap in the face for Hungarian architects. And then again, this starts to happen from time to time, again and again. There is the planned Budapest Expo, first in 1995, the Budapest Vienna Expo, and then in 96, the Budapest Expo, which would have given an amazing opportunity for Hungarian architects, of course, to show their talents, their knowledge, their know-how to the international scene, but then this gets cancelled because of financial problems. And then there is the National Theatre competition, which is won by Ferencben, by this quite interesting looking, let's call it the constructivist scheme in 1996, and they actually start to build it, and they start to construct the whole building when there is an election and the new government comes, and they stop the construction process, and they decide on a different spot, on a different architect, and on a different building. And what actually gets erected causes a huge debate, of course, amongst Hungarian architects, because they have to face, for the first time in their lives, usually, or probably, is that what politicians like, what politicians think about architecture is something quite different that we have thought about architecture. So if you really want to describe or criticize or think about this building, it becomes super hard because it was done by different aesthetical, functional standards than you thought belong to architecture. This is a different kind of architecture. It's even very hard to talk about it, actually. But still, politicians are right in a way, because most of the average people prefer this architecture to this architecture. So there is this crack begins to appear in what we think about architecture at the end of the 90s, that somehow another world, another reality materializes, and this is the first time where it actually materializes as a constructed building, and people, architects, professionals start to wonder whether they are right or wrong. The fourth big disappointment is now we are getting along in time. This is 2007, the new government quarter. Again, there was a competition. There was a winner who, since that, quit architecture, absolutely, and they didn't even start to construct this idea, despite the fact that it won the Holcim Award in 2008 as the most sustainable proposal. Because of the economic crisis of 2009, they never even started the construction of this. And then the last big disappointment was, of course, the City Hall Forum of Budapest. Again, another project which never actually got off the table, which always remained on paper. So we have passed these years full of disappointment, full of questions, full of disappointments and questions. And then in 2010, a new government comes, and one of the first things that they decide is that they actually want to build stuff. Okay, so no more questions about whether we are allowed to do stuff, whether we should build in a way or another way. We want to prove that it is possible to build. And they managed to, at first, they managed to realize projects which are without basically any debate or discussions, which are long awaited, such as the renovation of the Várkert Bazaar in Budapest. This is a beautiful 19th century architectural decoration, if you may, at the foot of the Buda Castle Hill towards the Danube. It's basically just a garden and a series of shops next to it by the best Hungarian architect of the 19th century, Ybl Miklós, which was waiting for reconstruction for decades at that time. And there was even a proposal to turn it into a shopping mall, which was probably the worst idea ever, because it's very hard to reach with public transport and cars, and there is no space at all for shops. So you would have to excavate basically the whole hill. But thankfully, this idea was abandoned, and after a series of very rapid political decisions, the whole building was reconstructed in the early 2010s for general appeal, I must say. So I think this building was quite nicely received by both architects and the general public. And this obviously gave a new dynamic to political will, and they invested this dynamic. They invested the trust of the public into a series of huge construction projects from the early 1910s onwards. They invested this will into a series of reconstruction projects of sacral monuments, of churches, either in Budapest or in the countryside. this is really huge what we are talking about. So like hundreds of churches were renovated in Hungary in the past decade or so, without basically anyone questioning whether this money should go to that aim or not. Because what the government also acknowledged, also realized, is that we, or they must have huge events to show that their goals are being achieved. And one of these events was, of course, the 54th International Eucharistic Congress, which was supposed to be held in Budapest in 2020, but was then 1 year delayed because of the pandemic. Another huge event would have been, and might still be, the Olympics, a long-held Hungarian dream for at least 100 years, picked up again and again by different governments and by different politicians. And it's still very much on, so it's still very much in political consciousness that we could and we should organize an Olympics in Hungary. And what we are actually doing right now when discussing or when realizing sports-related infrastructural projects is that we are getting ready for a possible Hungarian or Budapest Olympics in some time in the mid-future. And one of the main projects that was prepared for this is the construction of the new Puskás Ferenc Arena. And here, what we see is the predecessor, is the People's Stadium, which was a 1950s building. And the original idea, which was pitched by the architect Skardeli György, who designed the new building, was that we should keep at least some parts of the 1950s arena, because they are very nice elements that people identify with. The story says that during reconstruction, it turned out that this building cannot be kept anymore. So basically, at the end, the only part of the building that was kept is this little tower here, and everything else around it, which is of course a way bigger stadium than it was before. It has a 67,000 capacity or something like that, is new. It reminds the old building, but it's absolutely newly constructed. And this is one of the cases when it turned out that creating a new architectural identity, even if it resembles to something historical, is way more important than actually keeping original architecture. So this was one of the cases after 2010 when the architectural community had to face with the fact that this building, the old People's Stadium, which for long should have been a protected monument but never got through the administration, disappears without anybody questioning that it should, I mean anybody from the political side, that it should be kept. Another huge and I think quite important currently ongoing project is the new Museum of Transport. And this is again something new, because this was one of the first cases where politics decided to look outside of the country and to held an international competition and then embrace the winning design, which was by Diller, Scofidio and Renfro. Basically after Sue Fujimoto's win in 2014 at the House of Music competition. This was the second international competition which was won by a very well-known name in contemporary architecture and then embraced by politicians. I don't know how your politicians are, but it is my general feeling that politicians usually are not really interested in who are the big names in contemporary architecture. So the fact is that this competition was won by one of the best known international offices, and then the concept was embraced by the government and giving green light. That was a huge thing that happened in Hungary. We don't know, of course, that this is going to be constructed or not. The plans are, they are still currently working on the plans. And the aim would be to reconstruct this former train depot and to create a new addition, a new entry building in front of it as part of a huge brownfield renovation project in the east of Budapest. And yes, I have already shown you this image about Su Fujimoto, the designer of the House of Music, which is part of the Liget Budapest project, of course, which is like one of the biggest so-called cultural urban reconstruction projects currently going on in Budapest. The House of Music is one of the most visible examples that was realized as part of this project. Another quite visible example is the new Museum of Ethnography. The whole project is still going on, but again, this gives you an idea about the change of thinking in scale, for example. So what we see here and what we have seen in the previous examples is that what matters to the architecture of politics is size. They love size. So the bigger something is, the better it is. They are not very much into renovations or keeping the original building or like adding small additions to something. They want to create something big and something new. The main difference basically between these two worlds is that the architecture of professionals is about design and construction. The architecture of people is about use, is about everydays. And the architecture of politics is about one specific point in time. It's about inauguration. Inauguration is the most important event, whatever can happen in the architecture of politics. And this is not the inauguration event because he couldn't make it to the inauguration. But yes, the inauguration is always super important. It is so important that, for example, Várkert Bazaar, which I have shown earlier, was inaugurated 2 times. Like two months between the different events. So what happens now, what started to happen after 2010 is that on one hand we started to create very quickly and very efficiently new buildings or renovations, and on the other hand we started full-heartedly to ignore if something gets lost. And I have, because again that's the field I'm mostly interested in, I decided to bring a few examples just to show you, just to remember a little bit to these buildings, because I think it's as architects you should see, and as an art historian even I am able to see that there is an incredible potential in these buildings that we have lost during the past years. But because of this quick and strong-willed political decision-making that is ruling architecture nowadays in Hungary, we have lost these buildings because we never had the time to discuss their actual values. And this, for me, is one of the most obvious examples. This building is was in the very heart of Buda, the Buda side of the city. A huge industrial hall reminding in every sense the Tate Britain building in London. But then, without any hesitation, basically, the government decided to demolish it and to realize a garage and a park in the spot. This example by one of the lesser-known 1960s architects, Kis Elászló, was one of the buildings that clearly showed the influence of the late Le Corbusier in Hungary. It would have been the perfect museum of architecture, in my opinion, with a very nice office building and then with a huge flat factory wing. Unfortunately, this was again demolished without any hesitation for a new commercial development. This building was not favored by many, but for me it was always close to my heart because I wrote my thesis, my art history thesis, on this architect, Szabó István. This was again in downtown Pest, an office building and a connected garage, again demolished in 2017 for commercial development. I have mentioned already the Liget Budapest project. the House of Music with Sue Fujimoto is part of. Petőfi Csarnok, which was the biggest event and entertainment hall in Budapest from the 1980s, was demolished as part of this project, because what is expected to happen in its place is the new National Gallery, which again is a result by an international competition won by Sana, the Japanese studio, and it's waiting for the construction to start. And this example shows that this doesn't only happen with modern architecture. So it also happens with historical architecture, which should be kept, or at least which should be discussed. The former municipal slaughterhouse, which was one of the biggest end of the 19th century building complexes in Budapest, was demolished without any hesitation, without any debate in 2019. It was bought by a private constructor, and I think you can imagine what's going to happen here in the spot of the slaughterhouse by the examples standing next to it. I think these examples are quite familiar for the Bratislava audience as well. So this is what's going to happen here. And what we have lost is a unique 1872 complex, industrial complex, which of course could have been reused in various different ways, but without any hesitation and without any state-level protection, it was demolished. And then back to modernism and late modernism, another very interesting example, which unfortunately stood on a prime plot next to the Balaton Lake and was demolished 2 years ago, despite a serious opposition by locals and by the architectural community. And then this building, the Vituki office tower, which was demolished because of the construction of a new new national stadium for athletics. And the funny thing is that in the first proposals, this building was even kept, because the stadium is right next to it. It's not on the spot. The stadium is being built right here. And the architects, they suggested to keep the building. It's a useful building. It was in a good state. But at the end, it got demolished. And I have to say, basically without any official explanation. So we don't know why they decided to give up this building with a lot of usable floor space and with, I think, a quite nice architectural language. We are also losing monuments or edifices from the 1980s, so quite recent buildings. And there are some more on the line. So this is supposed to be demolished. Actually, demolition works should have been started already, but they withdrew the open call for a demolition expert. And this is one of the late chief works by Pázmány Margit is waiting for demolition. And what happens is that while we are losing this heritage without any open discussions, without any dialogues between government and architects, we started to recreate something even older. This started with the announcement of the National Haussmann program aimed at the reconstruction of the royal castle in Buda and its surroundings. And the first building that were reconstructed were the riding hall, the so-called Stöckel staircase, and the guardhouse next to it. This is actually one complex. So this is the riding hall, and this is the guardhouse and the staircase here. As you see, there was nothing there before. So these buildings, which were constructed at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, as part of the reconstruction of the whole royal palace, were damaged in the war and then demolished in the 60s and the 70s, mainly in the 70s. And there was nothing on their spot, just a reconstruction of the former medieval castle wall. So when the government announced that they are going to reconstruct these few buildings, these few additions for the castle, what people basically thought is that, okay, this is all right. So there is nothing on that spot, and why wouldn't we do this? There was, of course, not of course, but there was a small group of architects and monument people in monuments protection who said that we shouldn't rebuild 19th century monuments at the beginning of the 21st century or in the 21st or in the 2020s, because this is going to be fake. This is going to be not true. This is going to be not original. And again, this was one of the debates, the discussions in Hungary, where it turned out that what one thinks about what's true and what's original and what's real is absolutely different about what the other thinks about it. Because politicians said that, hey, this is the original, this is true, and this is just something that happened in between. And we shouldn't keep these fake medieval walls, because we should reconstruct a real 19th century building. And of course, it's not a real 19th century building, because it was built like 5 years ago. But it absolutely looks like one. This is not the Skopje 2014 projects. I don't know, sorry, I haven't bought any slides about that, but you might have heard about this huge reconstruction project which went on in the capital of Macedonia a few years ago in Skopje. They reconstructed some historical buildings, and then they covered modernist facades with historicist facades in a very bad aesthetical quality. This is not it. This project was worked on by some of the best people in Hungarian monuments protection, and it really creates an illusion of being original. If you walk there, you wouldn't be able to say that this is new. Maybe you would now, because it's totally new, but in 10 years it's going to look like if it's from the 19th century. And this is the point where, when people, especially architects, started to ask, are we allowed to do this? Are we allowed to create an environment which doesn't show its age, or which shows a different age? Because we never did that. And of course, we did that before, like 100 years before, but we didn't do it since the end of the Second World War. We never did that in Budapest, actually, after the war. The thing that happened in Warsaw, for example, we never did that. We just started it right now. Can we do that in 2020? Are we allowed to do that? What will people think? And then it turned out that politics is not interested in these debates, or it's past these debates. They started to do it. The first interior that was reconstructed from the former royal castle is the Hall of Saint Stephen. Everything which you see here is not older than 6 years. Everything, the pictures on the walls, the wooden decoration, the covering on the wall, everything. This hall was completely destroyed during the Second World War, and it was absolutely reconstructed during the past 8 years. And now it's there. It's the singular. It's one single room for the former royal castle, because there's nothing else. I'm exaggerating, but there is almost nothing else remaining from the original castle. So this was the first room to start to be reconstructed, and of course, although it wasn't said completely honestly that this is a model project, everybody knew that this is going to be a model project, and this is going to be the model for continuing the reconstruction of the castle and of the interiors of the castle. And during this process, we started, or the government started, other renovations and reconstruction projects. Again, this is a quite complex story, the story of the National Defense Headquarters right next to the castle. So the castle is actually behind this building in Buda. It was built at the end of the 19th century, then it was damaged during the war and partially demolished. This is the state that was left for 70 years on the spot. We just couldn't figure out what to do with this half building. There were numerous competitions from the 70s onwards. This is one of the latest examples. Sorry for the bad image quality. This is actually by Peter Kish, who was one of the participants of the series. He won this competition for the Szentgyörgy Square and for this building, but it was of course never constructed. And what we are doing right now, after basically a political decision, because again, this was not discussed by the architectural community, is that we are reconstructing the original mass and the original appearance of the building. 3H, the studio of Günther Zsolt, was involved in this reconstruction. And I'm not telling you this to show fingers, I'm telling you this to prove that there are good architects involved in this projects. Some of the best architects in Hungary are actually involved in some of the reconstruction projects, despite the fact that these are not accepted as valid by the architectural community in general. They are either undiscussed, so like kept under the rug, or they are completely opposed. And despite the fact, some architects are involved, which helps these buildings to be better than expected, let's say that. So at the end, I think this is going to create, again, a very interesting situation, because there's going to be probably a very acceptable reconstruction done by an accepted architect, expecting people to, I don't know, accept its reality. The final phase of this lecture, I'm going to show you what is currently going on in the Buda Castle, because I just, so a few weeks ago, I was getting ready for another lecture. This is the lecture season for me. And I just wondered about this topic, and then I realized that there are at least 10 similar, very similar historical reconstruction projects going on in the Buda, just in the Buda area right now, or just finished. And I think this number in itself shows that this is bigger than we thought. This is not about the government wanting something and doing it while the architects don't care. This is about creating a different understanding of architecture and a different world of architecture. So I think these 10 projects really show that there is this different reality that I talked about at the beginning of the lecture, which is not what we usually think of when we think about contemporary architecture. It's something different. Because this building is not what we usually think about when we think about contemporary architecture, despite the fact that it was originally designed by one of the best late modernist architects of Hungary, Kerényi József. He was the one in the late 90s who imagined this building, which was completely demolished after the war, to be rebuilt, but in a different way, in a way that the facades next to the windows could be opened towards the panorama of the city. So this building is not actually a reconstruction, it's more like a new architectural machine that resembles the original. It doesn't even use the original material, because this was plaster originally and now it's stone. But still, it looks like the original. It gives you an illusion of the original mass and of the original architectural details. So I think most people accept it as an original, or as something very close to the original. The second project and the whole Buddha movement started with the decision of moving the Prime Minister's office from the parliament, which is here, to the castle hill next to the office of the president. There is a former Carmelite monastery, and the government decided to move the Prime Minister's office there. And I think this decision, which was made in 2011, basically decided the fate of the whole area, because this was followed by the foundation of the introduction of the National Houseman Program, the renovations, the ongoing renovations of the castle, and some other projects in the Buda city itself, such as what I already introduced you to, the Royal Riding Hall. This is the interior. I haven't shown you the interior. It's exactly the same as it has been before the war. Again, the reconstruction of the National Defense headquarters. I have already talked about this. The reconstruction of the former Ministry of Finance. This is again a very interesting story. So this is how the building looked before the war. It's from the early 20th century by let's be honest, by a lesser quality architect, by not one of the main names, Fellner Sándor. And then it was reconstructed in a quite particular way after the war. Rados Jenő, who was one of the household names in Hungarian monuments protection, decided to keep the main mass of the building, but to demolish this middle part, because there was a general agreement that it's way too high to the average masses and the cityscape of the castle. You can even see here that it's way higher than this average dwellings. And he created a new facade using parts and details of the original facade. This was generally accepted in the 1950s and even since then as a good example of post-war reconstruction. And then there was a political decision about reconstructing the building and giving it back its original purpose. Because moving the Prime Minister's office to the castle didn't only mean that one singular office. It also meant that we will give back the castle its original purpose, its pre-war purpose, which was it was it was basically where most of the ministries and heads of the state offices had their headquarters. So the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Finances, the Ministry of Military, they all had their headquarters in the castle. And along with moving the Prime Minister's office up to the castle, again, next to its pre-war location, there was a decision about moving all other possible ministries back to the castle. So now this building is being reconstructed to its pre-war form and to its pre-war function. So it's going to be the financial ministry again. This is right in the middle of the castle next to the Matthias Church. The sixth example of the reconstruction of the former headquarters of the Hungarian Red Cross, which is actually just opposite of the National Defense headquarters. So I'm talking about this building here. This has also been demolished after the war, and there was an empty plot on its place since that, basically, for 70 years. And now there are reconstruction works ongoing, and actually this building was already topped a few weeks ago, back to its pre-war state, not actually the pre-war state, but more like the pre-1920s state. Again, I think this could be another topic, how one decides which is the original state and which should be built back. The seventh currently ongoing historical reconstruction project is the rebuilding of the former Archduke Joseph's palace right here next to the royal castle. Again, this plot was empty since the demolition of the palace in the 1970s. And now, after 50 years of being an empty plot, there was a decision a few years ago to build back this state of the building, which is from the very early 20th century. This is not a very good architectural example of the early 20th century, but it's gonna get back there to the square. These three last examples are actually the most telling, in my opinion. Again, because they also are about our relationship with modernism and with the heritage of the previous era. So this building was created in the 1970s next to the National Archives by Virág Csaba. They like the Hungarian high-tech architect. I think to a general architectural appeal. Virág was quite conscious about keeping in line, so keeping the cityscape, the streetscape, and the masses. But on the other hand, he used the most modern available architectural element. He used a very nice mirroring curtain facade, and the interiors of the building. Yeah, I'm showing a few here. Were also quite nice. So this is how it looked originally. This is already after not very well done reconstruction. Unfortunately, it lost the original shining. But as you see here, the general mass was very well in tone with the other buildings of the city, of that street. And the interiors, I'm just showing you one interior. This was the best interior. The general council hall were quite exceptional. So this building was one of the highlights of the architecture of the 1970s. And when the government first decided to demolish it in 1914, there was such a general opposition that they managed to that the opposition and the architectural community managed to convince the government to keep the building and to refurbish it and to use it as an office. And everybody thought that, hey, we made it. So we managed to convince the government to keep this building, which looked like this. So, I mean, it didn't show its best face, but some of the people remembered how it looked, and it still had these amazing interiors. But then, a few years ago, like 2 years ago, it was demolished without even continuing the discussions that were started in 2014, and without any warning signs. It was just demolished, and what's going to be built in its place is a new wing for the National Archives, which never existed. So this wing was not built at the early 20th century when the National Archives were finished. We have plans for it, and of course the archives need the space, but this decision to construct this historicist wing was not done by the National Archives. It was not done by consulting monuments protection people or architects. It was done by the government, and so that's what's going to happen. The ninth example is, of course, the reconstruction of the former royal palace, which, of course, the reconstruction of the royal riding hall proved to be the predecessor of this process, and now the reconstruction is ongoing. It started with the northernmost wing of the castle, which is going to get back its pre-war state and size, which differs from actually with what we see now. And again, a very interesting thing is, I think, that the chief architect of this project, the reconstruction of the palace, is Gutowski Robert, who is one of the best contemporary architects in Hungary. This again shows that this is not necessarily a project that is excluded from the architectural field or from the architectural community, because there are good architects working on it, and still it's somehow exists in a different reality. Some of the very nice modernist interiors of the current former royal castle, which houses the National Gallery, all of these are going to disappear, of course, if the reconstruction goes the way it is now, it looks now. And the 10th and last example is one of the examples which, again, stirred up a little bit the architectural scene in Hungary lately, because this was, again, done in a way to demolish an existing building, and a quite loved building from the 1980s by a very well accepted architect, Farkasdi Zoltán. This is again on a prime spot, right next to or right in front of the Matthias Church, in the middle of the hill. This building was also very well accepted in the 1980s because these vertical elements, they resembled the Gothic structure of the church. It didn't age necessarily that well. It's not even a prime example from the architecture of the 1970s. Actually, it was designed in the 70s. But still, most of the opposition of the architectural community came from the fact that it was demolished without any previous discussion. It was demolished even without discussing what possibilities should be given to this plot, because it was without any competition that the task to recreate the previously existing facades on that spot was given to, again, a quite well-known and a quite talented Hungarian contemporary architect. And the strange thing that is going to happen here is that this plot is going to get back a series of facades that resemble to what has stood there before the war, but in the interior there is going to be a contemporary conference hall. So what we are creating here is a very strange mixture of something that from afar resembles a historical facade, but if you go closer, it makes it obvious that this is something contemporary. And when you enter, it's a very openly contemporary building. And we are doing that in the place or in the spot of this actual, original, undoubtedly original and valuable building, without discussing whether this could have been refurbished to the purposes of the new function. So, when I was thinking about that, of course this is rhetorical, but still, I mean, it's time to ask ourselves whether contemporary architecture still means what we mean by it, whether we are still able to use the language to discuss contemporary architecture without questioning ourselves. And whether we are able to continue discussions with others who participate in projects like this. And do we still have like the overlaps? Can we still understand each other? Can we still continue these discussions? In my opinion, yes. So contemporary architecture doesn't end with this incredible series of developments in Hungary. But we have to acknowledge the existence of these. We have to acknowledge the existence, the importance of modernist heritage on one hand, and the existence of a need and a will and an acceptance of historical reconstructions. Because that is a fact. These are happening in Hungary right now, and these are appreciated by politicians and people. And we, architects or people next to, or close to architecture, we have to find a way to understand the needs of these people and to create a shared language again. Because we are losing the meaning of our language. We are losing the meaning of original. We are losing the meaning of real. We are losing the meaning of valuable. And if we don't find that common meaning again, we are going to lose our language to discuss architecture totally. And yeah, I came back. I love photos of my son, sorry. So we shouldn't cover our eyes. We won't be invisible anyways. We should find new ways to look at stuff, to look at architecture, as he's doing here with using, you know, I don't know, we had to change in the summer cottage shit, I don't know what's that called. You realize what he's doing there. He's trying to figure out if there is a way to look through. And that's what I suggest. So we should try to figure out if there is a way to look differently at these projects. Not necessarily accept them. We are able and we have to debate these projects, but we have to start these debates. We have to start acknowledging each other, and we have to start talking to each other, because this won't go well without this. Thank you very much for your patience and, and for the possibility.
Daniel, thank you very much. This was really exciting journey, not only through the history of Hungarian architecture, but also through the, let's say, contemporary situation and debates, or absenting debates in our field of architecture. I was wondering that perhaps we should ask the question where the need for such a kind of expressions in architecture comes from. Why actually the politicians or the, let's say, ordinary people, why they prefer actually this reconstruction of history instead of a common language of contemporary architecture, or let's say contemporary language of architecture. So do you have any answer for this, or any explanation? Because it happens actually in Slovakia as well, and it happens in all countries, I would say, that there is a kind of appearance of this, let's call it conservatism, or I don't know how to explain it. So do you have any idea why it is like this?
I think, and that's why I actually wanted to introduce you to the historical precedents, because I think that kind of gives an explanation for this question. I think this phenomenon comes from a very strong feeling of nostalgia, of nostalgia towards a past when everything was better. And in this case, this is the past before the Second World War, of course. And the funny thing is that we are just repeating a phenomenon which already happened in the interwar period, where there was this nostalgia towards a distant past when everything was better. We are just redoing the same thing again. And this is both interesting and frightening to see, because we know where this nostalgia led historically in the interwar period. It didn't lead to nice places, let's say that. Is there a way to do this differently right now? I'm asking, and this is a rhetorical question. I don't know, but I'm quite sure that this comes from the very same spot, from this nostalgic feeling towards a past where everything was supposedly better.
For me, it's quite surprising that, okay, these kind of moods, they repeat, or they come like regularly in the history, and we have this kind of feelings, feeling nostalgic. But actually, what I'm wondering is, why do we have the same nostalgia in Slovakia and in Hungary? And we are referring actually to the very same, let's say, ideas of the history, or the historical forms, which is, for me, it is a question of what is the ideology behind it, because I mean, there is a different one in Hungary and there is a different one in Slovakia. And if I just mention what happened on the castle of Bratislava Castle, it was the very same way of thinking about the history, of removing the layers of 1950s and 1960s, and even later layers, and just reconstructing a kind of ideal Baroque image of the castle. But It is not really our Slovak history. This is the Habsburg monarchy. So I would understand if it happened in Budapest, because this is, let's say, a national, Hungarian national history, but not really, like, you know, this is strange.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. I think also what plays a big part in this process is that you know, thanks to digitalization and the internet, we slowly lost the way of understanding each other, and our words lost their meanings. This is very hard to talk about. So there are no canons anymore, right? And not even in architecture history. Nobody is interested what I think about what the best modernist buildings in Hungary should be. Nobody is interested whether there is a professional body which suggests new buildings for monuments protection. Nobody asks us, because everybody thinks that, hey, I know better, and if not, I can just Google it. So all this information which became available also played a big part in like blurring the borders between professional knowledge and people who think that they know stuff. And there is this general feeling of instability. I'm not a philosopher, but there are a lot of contemporary philosophers talking about this. And the only thing that seems to be stable, the only thing that seems to be like on its spot is the past, is history. So the only thing we can do is grab back and get stuff from history, which is funny because history is not one-sided, it's not one story. There are a lot of different narratives overlapping. So if you are a historian, you know this, that you can tell a historical story from two entirely different and opposing perspectives. But of course, in general, it looks very stable and very agreed upon and so on. So it's a lot easier to get back there than to start discussions on whether, oh, has this modernist building, has this modernist architecture any values? I don't know. Maybe, no. Yeah.
We can quote our great Czech writer Milan Kundera, who wrote that even like looking in the past, even the guillotine looks beautiful because it has this historical aura or whatever. So, and perhaps this is also the order. The people are looking in this instability that you want to have a kind of everything is clear, well ordered, and this is what our historical styles are about. So this is a kind of simplification, but anyway. So, but questions from side of our audience, so I will. Yes, we have several of them. Oh, I'm really excited, but there was this hand.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to add shortly on this because I don't know how is the situation in Hungary, but here in Slovakia we can see like many people being nostalgic about how the late 20th century was for them, and I find that it's quite strange that there is this different point of view, like okay, for architecture, for art, we go way further back in time than in considering, let's say, general life. Like people will be telling you, okay, you know, the communists, they did bad, but there was like housing and blah blah blah, and it's kind of surprising for me that they are quite against the architecture that was being built in this era, that I would imagine it could become the symbol of this good old times for them, while we can see it's not the case. Do you have, or have you found any possible explanation for this phenomenon?
Sorry, I lost you at some point. For this phenomenon of people being nostalgic towards the
yeah, like people are being nostalgic even about this period of modern or let's say about the period in which the modern architecture was produced, while that modern architecture is not protected, is not considered as beautiful, has not become the symbol of that era for them, and they cling only to, let's say, 18th, 19th century.
But you're saying that there are still people being nostalgic towards the 1960s and 70s and 80s. Yeah, this phenomenon actually doesn't really happen in Hungary, and I think that this actually was one of the topic of the lecture ideas that I thought about, to talk about why is there so this feeling that, for example, the Slovak radio building is like a symbol of Bratislava right now, and you see it on T-shirts, and you can get these rizocuts or whatever about the buildings. This doesn't happen in Hungary. So there are very few people interested in that, and I think that's partly because we don't have such examples in Hungary, such visible and understandably unique examples of modernism, because again of various historical reasons. Simply Hungary didn't need that huge public buildings in the 60s and the 70s, so there was no political will to create a new symbolic buildings in this time, in part also because Hungarian architecture was not that close to the Slavic community, and I hope I don't offend anyone with that, but there was this, the creation of these new modernist iconic monuments was more characteristic in Slavic countries than in Hungary, for example. So we were not that much in connection with the surrounding eastern region, I think. And there are also several other reasons. But at the end, what I wanted to get out was that I don't see the nostalgia in Hungary towards the Kádár era. So there is, of course, a general nostalgia among older people towards their childhood, which is normal. But architecture-wise, there are very few people discussing whatever is happening with these buildings, and
I don't think that we have really this kind of nostalgia in Slovakia. We do have some interested young people who are somehow dealing with this architecture heritage, but speaking about the general public, it is not nostalgic about the architecture heritage of this era. They are just nostalgic about the production or the feeling of welfare state, considering the nice recreation and facilities and nice life without any, consideration because of the socialist regime. So this is not really about the, let's say, architecture heritage of welfare states, and of course there are some exceptions, especially among the young generation, but when we speak about, let's say, monument protection of these kind of buildings, we lack protection of most of them. So this is really the debate is quite the same in all the countries of not only of the communist bloc, but also of Western countries. Just have a look at France or at United Kingdom, etc., etc. We are facing demolitions everywhere in Europe, considering the welfare state architecture. But there is another question here, and then we have question
Hello, thank you. I just feel like saying something because it's kind of hanging in the air the whole time and we didn't really pronounce it, but isn't this whole endeavor that you've shown, everything that's happening in the contemporary architecture, isn't it just it goes hand in hand with urban, nation-oriented politics that feels just bring back the old past, but of the great Hungary and that period. So isn't it more just the question of the ethics? When I think about the architects that you mentioned, that they are well respected and actually good professionals. So doesn't it put them in the the kind of ethical question whether or not this is right?
It depends on where you're watching it from. Yeah, I was expecting these kind of questions.
Like, I don't want to oversimplify it, but like to me, it looks kind of obvious, so maybe I'm wrong, I don't know.
I'm glad you have that opinion. It's not necessarily, I mean, I'm trying not to form such opinions because I want to examine this phenomenon as a historian, of course. But you are open to form such an opinion, in my on my view. And that's one of the valid opinions that you can form, I think, based on these events. Yeah, or one of the valid questions that you can ask, whether it is ethical to be involved in such a heavily politicized construction project.
Yeah, this is also not the first time that it happened in history. I mean, we have several examples of such dilemmas of architects,
and
whether to serve the regime or not.
At the end, the building remains. That's,
yes,
I think,
exactly.
what most people think.
This is what they rely on it, that, yeah, I don't want to go into details, but we have a written question from our colleague here.
Just a less divisive and less polarized question. Just referring back to your, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, you spoke about the interwar architecture as being more progressive or open and tolerant towards culture and cultures like that. How is architecture tolerant or intolerant? Is this specifically for interwar or the functionalist architecture, or can it be applied to architecture in general?
That's a very good question, actually. Yeah, I think it all depends on people, of course, who are doing architecture. So it doesn't necessarily, a building is not either tolerant or intolerant, but the profession who creates it and the society who creates it can be more tolerant or not. And then, of course, this goes back to architecture. This has a backward effect on what kind of architecture is being created. And I don't think this is a phenomenon that should be explained. This is a phenomenon that should be understood by looking at the buildings, actually, and by leaving your impressions talking instead of you. So it's not necessarily something that I can explain logically, but I think it's something that you can feel when you look at the buildings that are being created.
Just raise your hands when there is another question that I can see you. If not, I would like to go another, let's say, aspect of your speech, because I was wondering, the most examples you shown us of being like state investments. And if I just try to to look at what happens here in Slovakia, and if I would like to show state investments, it would have been only highways and well. So I'm wondering, is it really like that the state is investing so much in let's say cultural and educational infrastructure, and what about the private investors? What are they focusing on and which language of architecture are they using?
Well, in this sense, yes. I mean, state investments are quite unique. That the cultural projects are this important is quite unique. I think in Europe at the moment, in Hungary, private investors are very similar to whatever happens in all the other countries. Of course, Hungarian private investors are mostly interested in housing, are mostly interested in participating in state-funded infrastructure projects, and so on. Yes, what I have shown you shows that there is, or at least they say there is, a renaissance in cultural infrastructure projects, in cultural building in Hungary. It's another way to understand whether you accept this or not. For example, the Liget Budapest project itself is quite heavily debated from the very beginning, because it constructs new museum buildings in a park in the middle of the city. using areas which were formerly either occupied by buildings or not. So green areas to construct museum buildings. The main question there is whether you should do this or not. The funny thing is that the questions were never about the importance of creating new cultural institutions, because everybody understood that that's important, and everybody agreed that it's a good thing to have new museums, it's a good thing to have new cultural institutions. The question was always about how we should do it and where we should do it. Yeah, and in this sense, I think, going back to your question, private industry, the private sector is not very different from whatever happens in other parts of Europe. Now we have started it. I think there are 1 or 2 examples already that the private sector also started to show interest in historical reconstructions. And if that happens, and if that becomes a phenomenon, that's going to be another interesting new chapter, I think. But this is far away yet from me talking about it, because it's now just the very beginnings.
Because it is somehow, it's easy to put it to say that, okay, you have a kind of authoritarian regime and it means that it must be conservative in architecture. Yeah? It's very easy. No. Because if you look at, I don't know, at a private investments, let's say in Britain, then you have examples of very conservative approaches, so it is not necessarily somehow tied together. So I was wondering if you already could discover something like this, that you have this kind of private investors which are really like following the same kind of architectural thinking than it is obvious in this state investments.
Just the very first signs, but then I will tell you the story. So there is a former hotel building in Debrecen, which had a 1970s addition. This is a very nice a building from around 1910, 1913 by Hajós Alfred. And it had a 1970s addition, and the new owner, which is a private foundation supported by the government, an educational foundation, they decided to make a competition on what should happen with this modernist wing of the building. They are the new owners of the whole hotel complex, and they want to turn it into an education complex. And this competition was, a few weeks ago, won by a design which creates a historical facade and a new historical wing next to the original building, and therefore creates an absolutely symmetrical block. This was never the plan, so Hajós Alfred, the original architect, never imagined a symmetrical block because it was in a very different disposition, the building originally. But now a symmetrical facade can be created, and now that's the winning plan. So I think that's the first sign that the private sector is following the ways of the government. It is quite obviously done by a foundation which is supported by the government, but it's still private. And I wonder whether there will be others following this way. So I really wonder if there will be other private historical reconstruction projects now. Of course, there were some in the past, but never in a niveau, never in a quality that we could discuss this. But these projects are all in such a high quality that this is architecture that we are talking about, and not, I don't know, mimicry or cheap fakes.
Thank you. This is very, very interesting, because this is something that, it happens already. Yeah. And I don't know if it is really a wave of new conservatism, like the British philosopher Scratton was writing about, or is it a kind of Rob Creer idea of a beautiful city? So we are really experiencing very, very, exciting times. Are there some more questions from the side of our dear audience? Perhaps our dear students? Oh yes, there is a question.
Hello, thank you for the lecture, and I have a follow-up question to my classmate. So we talked about the fact that this younger generation kind of seems to have some interest in the 20th century architecture, and I just wanted to ask, perhaps like in few years it will change, that maybe this kind of reconstructions will happen to the 20th century architecture, and maybe we will be that generation of architects that will put the 20th century architecture on the first spot and then maybe clean the layers of like no, like the later layers of
So the
like we will be the same in a way that the government is right now. Like,
would you do it?
No, it's not.
Not now.
It's not
But who
something
knows?
that I would do, but it's like a rhetorical question that we are like paying attention to the 20th century architecture, because now we know from these kind of examples that it's bad, that it's demolished. But what would you do to prevent this cycle to happen again?
This is again a very good question. I think basically the only thing that we can do, and thankfully that discussion is happening everywhere, is understanding that maintaining buildings is a way easier way to survive than constructing new ones. So I think at the end, and hopefully that's going to be quite soon, rationality will win over these debates, and we will all understand that we should reuse buildings and we shouldn't rebuild buildings, because it's cheaper, it's more efficient, and it's incredibly way more sustainable than recreating any former identities that we dream about. So I think this is the phenomena that can put an end to this process that we see right now.
Absolutely. I mean, with this is a nice conclusion, that let's not allow another generations of architects to demolish buildings, and this is what we perhaps can have understand as a kind of mission, of our common mission, and opinion that we can all share, I hope. So if there are no more other questions, I would like to, and there are not, so I would like to thank you once again. This was really exciting, and I have to state that this was the most exciting debate that we had, that we have today since the first lecture. So thank you, Daniel, very much for all this input.
Thank you. Thank you.